Hopefully you're here for making your course a space for tough conversations. This is who we are. You've got two of us teacher people, and we have actually AU grad / still here, and we're expecting one more representative of the student body to be here, so hopefully she'll come. But thank you for this. We only have one more slide, so you don't have to be taking notes about, all of the PowerPoint, Google Slides thing, which would make Professor Barron's head explode. She was like, "Don't do that," but nicely. It was a tough
nice.
It was a tough conversation.
Never nice.
But Eric, could you very importantly, it's a bummer that, we'll deal with it. It's a bummer that, can our tech person kind of make the slides so that it all fits? Or anyway, so we have, a set list of things what we want to do. We want to make sure that there's time for your engagement. That's important. But I think we'll send it over to our brilliant prof to set the stage for what we're doing, right?
Oh, I'm setting the stage? Okay.
Do you want me to set the stage, or do you want to set the stage?
Well, I sort of expected you would, but what the hell?
No, I
can do. I can do it.
Okay. Tough conversation.
About 2 or 3 months ago. About 2 or 3 months ago, I was at a Dean's Faculty Council meeting, and she said, "Let's talk about classroom climate. And how students are dealing with what's happening in the university, in the world." And there was sort of dead silence around the table. And nobody was ready to say anything. And in typical fashion, I opened up my mouth because I never know when to shut up. And I said, "You want to hear about classroom climate? I'm going to tell you what students tell me all the time, and how uncomfortable they are, how unwilling they are to engage for all kinds of reasons, a lot of which have to do with their fear of how their colleagues are going to respond to the things that they say, and how the faculty is going to respond to what they say." So although they may want very much to discuss the issues that are important in our society, they are reluctant to, for these reasons. We're here today to hopefully answer questions that you have about this, and to give you some perspective on what these students are experiencing, what works for them and what doesn't work for them, and to give you some ideas about what may work for you and what has worked for us. So that's where we are. We want to know what your concerns are. We want you to hear their concerns, and hopefully, in the end, give you some tips on how to deal with all of this.
And now that I have my slide on my phone, because I'm that kind of person, let me just show you. So that's why we're here. Let me just show you what we plan to do. This is universally designed, so you know where we are. So what we'd like to do is, Professor Barron has set the stage. In a moment after I tell you the agenda, we'd like to hear from you what you would call the barriers and challenges to having these tough conversations of any kind. We can get that from you, have a better sense of how to speak to that. We've got a student panel, which is wonderful, and each of them will spend 5 minutes letting you know their piece of the puzzle. A brief time for you to ask questions of them, geared toward that, what they've offered. Then we'll move to a methodology and solutions component, where Professor Barron will talk about setting the stage for your course. to be this way, and it's very important to say, it's not only making your classroom, it's making your course a space for tough conversations. So that's beyond what happens, Tuesday, Friday at 11. And then I will talk about some techniques within the class as it goes, from both class discussion, assessments, syllabi, beyond that. And then we'll go to this problem-solving active session all together. So that's where we are, and we have it as the list. That's actually great to have it that way. That's fine. So I had it listed that Mariette would actually. Are you okay?
There we go.
Yeah, that's fine.
Look at that.
Hi, so I'll just introduce myself and then I guess talk a little bit about my experiences in the classroom. So my name is Mariette Bahati, Mariette Buleke Bahati, and I'm a rising junior in I'm studying law and society, and I'm getting a certificate in women in leadership. Just to preface, I'm a first generation college student, so the world of academia is something that interests me because I grew up in a family where I'm the first of 6 generations of women to get access to education. So school and learning has always been a big part of my component growing up. And even though my mother never had an education, she didn't get past sophomore year of high school, it was enforced in my siblings that you guys will be educated, because that is the key and the puzzle to being better and doing better in life. So I think I always come into education and coming into classroom climates I don't have time for this nonsense because I've come here on a very different agenda. So in terms of how I interact with a lot of classroom climate and a lot of the problematic things that might come in classroom, say your problematic things, I need to pass my test because I've come from a different perspective. But I think being in college has been very, very, very interesting the last couple of years just because of what's been going on in the world. And I think we sometimes forget how college becomes a bubble. You become, especially living on campus for the last 2 years, you're in this bubble with these same people all the time, interacting with them, whether you're doing clubs with them, whether you're in classes with them, and you forget that wait, the rest of the world is still moving on, and these people who I'm always in this bubble with have opinions about what's going on in the rest of the world. So you go into classrooms and you're like, wait, you're great, you lived in my hall, but you said that and that's not okay. So it's been very interesting because I haven't had a lot of insane classroom things, but I think my big thing that I always try to talk about when I talk about campus climate is I think that your classroom should be a place of learning. And by that I mean, I feel like a lot of conversations, a lot of tough conversations that happen in classroom, it seems to me that everyone's trying to up-one each other. I have my opinion, you have your opinion, and I need to prove to you that my opinion is better than your opinion. And I think that is problematic when you're in a space where you're here to learn and you don't know everything. Because I think that even with professors and teachers, everyone comes into this space of, I have my opinions and my opinions are right because I have these facts that prove my opinion. Instead of, wait, I see where you're coming from. I understand that from your background and your experiences, you can see where that is. I have a little anecdote. In high school, I went to a school that was predominantly white, and a student in my senior AP class told me, "You're really smart for a black girl." And I looked at him and I was like, okay, elaborate. Because I was I really, really wanted to come from a good place, And he explained, I've been in amazing education systems my whole life, and I haven't seen people that look like you represented in those education systems. So for him, it's not that you're the only black person I think is smart, it's just when I've been in school, and I've been in amazing schools where they're ranked amazingly, I just don't see people that look like you. So therefore, from my upbringing and my raising, I see that people that look like you can't be smart because every one of my schools was smart because of the ranking and everything. And I didn't see people that look like you. And I looked at him and I was like, that makes sense. I don't agree with it, but I see where you're coming from your perspective. Because I remember in that class, I could have just snapped and been like, what do you mean I'm smart for a black girl? What do you And then that opened up the conversation of, let's talk about how people of color have been left out of education systems. And that's probably why you don't see people that look like me in your classrooms. And I think that's what I meant by, we need to open up classrooms to be more about learning, and instead of everyone trying to one-up each other. Because he could have said that comment and I could have said something else just as nasty, and nothing would have come out of that. But he explained this is my experience, and this is why I've said that from my experience, versus me attacking him wait, no. And I was like, all right, so from your experience, by by the way, let's learn some history that we never really learned in school, you know? And it was just, and I remember my teacher looking at me like, wait, I probably should have taught that history too. Like, feeling like, oh, it's also on me to do that. But also, I think as a student of color, you always feel awkward in classrooms during tough conversations because you feel like it's your job to represent, especially when you're in a lot of my classes, I've been either one or two people of color. So I'm like, all right, so if I don't say something, no one else will, because no one else feel like, especially in that scenario, if I hadn't responded, no one else in that classroom would have responded, because no one else feels that burden, and no one else understands what that meant. Like, no one had a personal connection to that phrase that he said. So I think that it's also been difficult as a person of color coming into education system, always feeling like you have to be the forefront of tough conversations, but also being like, wait, I've come here to learn too, so can I learn sometimes and not always be the one like teaching and navigating conversations? And even like in high school, like teachers would look at you like, you know, class on racism, they're like, oh, Samira, you want to talk? I'm like, no, I don't want to talk. I want you to. So I think that's my biggest takeaway from these tough conversations is like open up your classrooms to be a space where students can learn from each other instead of, oh, let me hear your opinion, because there's always those conflicting opinions, but if you don't leave that room to be, okay, I understand where your opinion is coming from, now let's learn the facts and the history that intertwine these things and understand where we're all coming from, instead of, oh, I'm going to attack you because this is how I was raised to think, versus this is how I was raised to think. Now we're all are in this bubble of disagreement, and you leave classrooms frustrated and just, oh, this was not a productive conversation.
Excellent.
Sure. So my name is Morgan Grant. I graduated last May with a degree in law and society, and now I'm back as a post-bac pre-med with the intention of pursuing psychiatry at some point. And on campus, I have experience working in sexual assault prevention, and I was part of the original team working on the Empower AU curriculum. So I mostly talk about trauma and consent and healthy interpersonal relationships more than I talk about anything else. So for me, I've been engaged in, I feel like, this conversation about trigger warnings for a long time. Back when the Faculty Senate released their statement a couple years ago, and a couple students stormed the meeting and had some strong words to say, and I feel like we're still having very similar conversations about how to deal with students in a room who have experienced trauma in some way, whether it be under our traditional definitions of trauma, so explicit brutalization in their past or in their childhood, or whether it's just an accumulation of these microaggressions that we constantly see coming up in the classrooms that don't get addressed, or are left to students who feel personally attacked by those comments to address them because professors for some reason won't. And what's worked for me more often than not is just recognizing when someone in the room gets disengaged, learning to see in a room full of 20 to 30 people when someone's having a problem, and addressing the comment that was made. I feel like so often when an uncomfortable statement gets made or a claim is made and there's just silence, and then there's the few students that feel personally impacted and go, okay, that really hurt me, and I need to say something. But for some reason, the rest of the room is just dead. And so for me, what's important is taking the onus off of the students who have been personally attacked by problematic statements, or maybe statements that weren't supported by fact, or even innocuous statements that just could have been phrased better, because sometimes that really is just the issue. It's just rhetoric. But it's about recognizing when people get hurt, acknowledging the statements that were made, deliberately choosing language and evaluating the language that we use, and just allowing space for students to come forward and say, that didn't feel right, or did anybody else get a bad vibe from that comment? There's something about that statement that doesn't sit right with me. I'll try to come up with a concrete example. I had a class where a professor would introduce anecdotes from his clinical practice and would, whenever discussing a female patient, which is, in psych classes, people with clinical backgrounds will often bring in their expertise, which is important. But whenever talking about a female patient versus a male patient, he would always comment on what she was wearing or the way that she looked. And that was not, it wasn't outright, but it was every single time. Every single time this professor mentioned a female patient, there was always that comment that followed. And after a while, I couldn't really listen to his anecdotes anymore. It was like, I don't know why you insist on discussing women in a way that puts appearance first and context second. That confuses me. It makes me disengage with the material. And the worst part about that was not that he didn't get it, because I could have had that conversation with him one-on-one. The worst part was that the room was not dealing with the subject. And I know that I wasn't the only person in that room who had a problem with the way he was speaking about women. I found that out later. But honestly, I didn't feel comfortable going to his office hours because of the way that he spoke about women and the way that he spoke about his clients, and it was not a great situation. But the silence in the room is really, I think, the most egregious to me. And so if we can figure out a way to cultivate classroom environments where students are encouraged to advocate for themselves in a way that is not attacking or trying to one-up one another, because that is a huge problem among students at AU. We like to throw our opinions back really forcefully, which I don't necessarily think is a weakness all of the time, but there's room for improvement. I just think breaking silence and acknowledging pain is really the root of what would help me in a classroom.
Super.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. My name is Eric Higas. I graduated in 2016 at SPA, and I'm here to provide some perspective on intellectual diversity and the value of intellectual diversity in a classroom conversation, especially in the Socratic style, because I always loved the Socratic style, felt that I learned a lot from it. As a conservative, I found it difficult to contribute my viewpoint in classrooms a lot of times because I knew I always had to be over-prepared because I was fighting against the default position of the room, if you will. It's not a problem to be over-prepared, but for someone who is more timid about speaking or someone who doesn't want to be as confrontational, it might not be the best environment, because if you feel like you're going to be constantly challenged and nitpicked and taken apart, then you're not going to speak. You're just going to, keep your opinions to yourselves. And I had some great professors that led really well balanced discussions, really well fostered discussions, Professor Schwartz being one of them. But I also had to face professors that were more interested in approaching these controversial subjects by talking at us instead of facilitating the conversation. So I'll give an example on discussions in a couple of classes that I had about a controversial topic, gun control. So some professors that led very successful conversations would start by just laying the groundwork of what the case law was, what the regular legislative laws were, and all that. So they'd say, Heller, the decision on gun control says you have a right to own a gun, but there are limitations allowed for the mentally ill, for felons, and also for dangerous and unusual weapons. So just laying the basic groundwork, not trying to say whether they should have those restrictions or should not have those restrictions. And then the conversation would be stimulated by a question like, okay, what does dangerous and unusual mean in this context? How do high-capacity magazines fit in the mix of this? Because these are issues that the court can directly talk about. So they're up for discussion, they're up for debate, and there's good arguments on both sides. And their involvement was to facilitate the discussion. They did a really good job at making sure that the discussion moved in a orderly and a very civil way. Any student opinions that were factually false could be pointed out, but any of them that were well-reasoned, even though it goes against the, say, default position of the room, are allowed to speak, and they're allowed to be given their time. professors that failed in this respect would just say their own opinions. They would interject their own opinions in the discussion. Like a real quote that I had was, "There's no legitimate reason for a citizen to own an AR-15." That is an opinion, and you can debate that opinion all day, but when a professor says that, it has the effect of shutting down that part of the argument for students that may believe there is a legitimate reason based on, what citizens want, what citizens need, and the limitations of the Constitution. But it shuts down that line of argument when the professor interjects that type of a loaded opinion. Another good tactic that I found helpful to facilitate these types of conversations were providing a basic summary of what each side believes. And you do have to be careful because characterizations can be taken out of context. And but saying the textualist argument for this, rule is X, or versus the living document version of this interpretation is X, or the progressive argument versus the conservative arguments are X. That will allow a conversation to occur because the ideas have been put out there. Now, obviously, you put out both sides so that hopefully both sides will feel welcome and invited into the conversation. But it's all about making sure that students who are either shy about their beliefs or maybe don't want to be thrown into the intellectual lion's den have an opportunity to feel like they can be a part of the discussion, to feel like their views are valued, whether you agree with them or not. They're a valuable part of the conversation. And I look forward to answering any questions.
And I realize I said, promised that you all could throw out some of your barriers and challenges and then didn't do it. So it's my barrier and challenge to intelligibility or something. But I'm wondering if we can incorporate the barriers and challenges and kind of relate it as well in some questions, for our wonderful students, for 10, 15 minutes, kind of get that up there. And then that way, when we go to our methodology component, it can be very responsive to that. That works for everybody. It's sort of weird when I have guests at AU. I don't know if this is your experience as well. They first have to tell me afterward how mind-blowing our students are for them and how intimidatingly great. So obviously, it always happens. But your thoughts.
Hi. Cameron, I'm an adjunct in SPA. I teach a political course. I teach real-time political course. It's obviously a little more challenging the past 6 months. But and I forget your name, to your point, and my whole background is I work on the Hill for a Democrat. I'm a Democrat, but I really try and foster diversity in thought amongst my students. My course is a lot of classroom discussion. I find that my conservative students are unwilling to share their opinions, which I feel is then a detriment to my liberal students, because my liberals, both sides need to hear the other side. And I've had a number of my conservative students approach me individually, expressing these concerns. They know that I will listen to them. But I then wind up kind of becoming the de facto conservative voice in the classroom because my conservative students are unwilling to speak up. And the three of you know, right, if a class of 30, it could be like 26-4,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's, there's not a lot for me to draw from, and I don't want to put a student in an uncomfortable position. I will encourage it, but if I'm not getting a reaction, I'm not gonna continue to drill down for that, and then I will wind up, kind of trying to be devil's advocate, or however you want to phrase it, and this then becomes upsetting to my liberal students because they think that I am therefore taking this position of conservative, and this is what I'm espousing, and I could say it to them blue in the face that that's not what I'm doing, but I'm trying to present the other side to you, and some of my students might get it, but others will not, and then it becomes a point of contention, which can last for the semester.
And just to speak to that, and we can get to that in methodologies, but a conversation that I have with my students very explicitly up front, we'll do this at greater length, is partly challenging this idea that disagreeing with the professor. I don't like just throwing out the opinion. I think Eric's got a great point. Challenging the idea that the fact that you and the professor don't have the same political, ideological identity orientation is a problem. And I talk about what's the worst thing that can happen. You know who I voted for. What's going to happen to you? Like, or how many tigers are going to eat you? Like, let's talk about what my feeling differently than you or what your classmates feeling differently to you can do to you in terms of the outcome of this course. Let's get that out there. And you'll see with Eric and Morgan and Mariette, those were very different things. But we have that out.
Yeah.
But they could also read my bio and they know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, but and then you find out, you know that I am a UN helicopter driving, gun grabbing, vegan, commie.
Those are so many things.
What's right? It's terrifying. What's going to happen because of that? What am I not going to offer you? What do I need to do for you? What is this class going to be as a result of my America-hating, gun-grabbing orientation to you? And students, if I take the, red meat-eating, gun-toting, whatever the opposite was, thing, what's going to happen to you if I say, Representative Brett, who Eric works for, is the smartest guy ever and has all the best ideas? What's going to happen to you? What do you think you're missing in this class? And have that conversation early. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. Yeah.
I think the way to deal with it is start at the very beginning with your syllabus, which is that you assign, that we should all assign conservative views or different points of view. So if you set the tone from the very beginning with multiple perspectives in your syllabus, and not just ones that you set up as the straw man to destroy, and that you look at it not in just in, what I do is, to me it's about analysis. There's strengths and weaknesses in every argument. Doesn't matter what they are in terms of the political spectrum. And I'm just addressing this now in terms of the political ideology thing. And I just think it's, especially in this society, we need to have students who understand critical thinking and listen and can think rationally. I no longer do debates because I only think it encourages the split. It only encourages us to only get into the views that we support. I do roundtable discussions where everyone has to come and analyze an issue from multiple perspectives. So I think that especially right now in the society, it is scary in the sense, I do think we have a society right now when things are getting more and more polarized. And so encouraging our students to buy into that is something I think it's very incumbent upon us to fight against. And so, if you want, I just think that what I believe personally is not that important in the classroom. I think pluralism is the most important thing in the classroom, which is that there be an honest exchange of ideas. And so I give...
I agree. My challenge is when I'm not getting it amongst the students, I have to chime in to present that opposite.
No, I don't think...
And I think we're going to actually move to the interchange a little bit after the... I'm sorry, because this is going to be a core part of what we do kind of in the second component, but I'm wondering if people...
Sorry if I jumped the gun.
No. It's like... sorry,
I feel very strongly about
it's
it.
very, very important. I'm wondering if we can throw up a
As
few...
a radical vegan, whatever.
Yeah. Are you... Yes. All right, this is... Okay. Yeah, I think we left out something about, homosexual abortionists or something. You just get it out there. But other challenges to
One of the biggest barriers and challenges that I have heard and seen and to be honest felt at times in the classroom is just a general discomfort with opening the floor to that conversation because you don't know how it's going to go. And so, there's a lot of discomfort with the unknown and confidence in your own skills for facilitating that conversation, regardless of where it goes, and trying to get it back on track and in a space that remains productive. And I think that there's a lot of fear, and so a lot of people just don't go there.
I would also, and I think it backtracks on what Brianna just said, caution against that there is a binary, that you're either politically liberal or politically conservative. I think many of our students, especially first-year students, developmentally are coming out of high school experiences where there is in right or wrong. Everything is either black or white or conservative or liberal. And I think that the student who doesn't, a first-year student often doesn't know how to voice dissent on one thing, agreement on another. We often have debates and you're on one side or another, but we don't allow for that gray area of thought. And sometimes that gray area might be an opinion or an intellectual argument, but sometimes it's just, I don't know yet. I haven't really welcomed that idea. It's the first time I'm hearing it.
I think another, to me, a challenge is I use the word diversity, but I mean mostly of just intellectual interest, not necessarily conservative, whatever, but coming at it with like maybe an interest in, like a lot of people have gotten up to speed on certain aspects of, Black history or Latino history or LGBT history. And so they'll have a conversation that's way up here. And then I've got students who are just like, and I say it's almost like I teach in a class where you've got non-native speakers and you got people fluent at home, but they don't have the structure, the grammar structure. And so you're trying to get everyone, and so I feel like I do a disservice to like the people who are up here who I'd love to have that conversation, because it's like, yeah, I'd like to engage with you about how kind of the background of Black Panthers and Black Manor and that kind of those political movements and safety movements and stuff like that, versus people who are like, I don't have a clue of what like this string of like acronyms that you just rattle off, and I'm trying, so you also have them that are little, but those are also the students we need to raise up so they understand the basic concepts. So I feel like I don't do it, especially with an intro level class or kind of a class where we're not at a 400 getting into the topic and we can really assign additional readings and get everyone up to speed, but we're covering a lot of ground in not a lot of time, but not wanting to do a disservice, but give intellectual support so people can make those arguments so that they have the background to do it and understand where they're coming from. So like the idea of like, I don't even know where I am, but it's like, okay, so let's give you some information so you can kind of figure out what resonates.
Other barriers and challenges?
I think for me, I see that there's the idea of like how you model civil discourse when there's not a lot of examples of that happening. And how do you teach it something that people aren't seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges that I've come up against is kind of something that I see maybe percolating within this conversation as well, is that on the one hand you have these challenging conversations that are intellectual in nature, as it was phrased, and when those happen, my large concern is often that conversation is touching on issues that can be personally triggering to students in the room. And so kind of navigating those two different types of difference, to put it kind of, in kind of clear-cut terms, is to me one of the biggest challenges to deal with, because someone may be speaking about something on an intellectual level that is deeply personal to someone else in the room.
Could I speak to that at all? I took a domestic violence class last semester, and in the syllabus, there was a line that said, please approach all material in this class as if the student next to you has had personal experience with these topics. And I think that's the first time I've really seen that on a syllabus. And for a domestic violence class, it was absolutely crucial. But I think for, when you're in classes that talk about justice and morality, and then policing comes up, and then, American climate comes up, and you have all these sorts of difficult conversations, I think the most important thing to remember is that when you speak as a student in a class or as a faculty member in a class or whatever, just try to speak as if the people in the room have had personal experiences with these subjects, because chances are they have, or they know people who have, or they have, experience with watching this stuff over and over and over again on the news, and that has its own traumatizing effects on folks. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be personal experiences, personal brutal experiences with trauma to release these sorts of emotions and reactions within the classroom, and it prevents those students who are really, really hurting from engaging with the material. And those are the folks who want to engage with the material the most, honestly, in my experience. Those are the folks that want to heal themselves by healing others. And that's something that I think that we should encourage, especially right now, with empathy and kindness and being able to treat each other with some kind of positive regard, with some kind of assumption that, like, I think your experiences are valid. I don't know what they are. I don't know you, but I'm going to try to be specific with my language so that I don't potentially harm you in a space where, you know, it's not supposed to be a safe space, but like a safer space for people to have these conversations and to be able to engage with them the first time. I mean, you're talking about, this is sort of what I've been toying with for a while, is that you have, especially with these, 100 level undergrad classes, and you've got 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and 19-year-olds in a room, you're talking about children and adults who are having formative experiences at that age. So what does that leave your responsibility as teachers? You're not, you're participating in the formative experiences of young adults. And these kids are learning about consent for the first time, and how to treat people with respect for the first time, and how to have civil discourse in a classroom about power and oppression for the first time with people that they've never even seen in these kinds of rooms before.
Keep it short.
Sure, yeah.
Sort of getting.
Sorry,
into
I got excited.
No, this is really important. I just want to make sure we throw up these things and then we really get it to.
Sure, but main point, super short. Just like, it helps to assume that the people in the room with you have personal experiences with these topics that some folks in the room can approach strictly academically, because that's not the case for most people in the room.
So other barriers to, challenges that we might be seeing to these tough conversations, to making students feel they can talk, making you feel like you can talk. There's a component of the academic freedom that people might be feeling.
Yeah, one of the questions I have, so I'm with the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. I'm not exactly a professor, but we still do a lot of education around workshops and things like that. But something important that we generally try to do is, saying the importance of people's opinions and voices, and making sure everyone feels equal and welcome. While at the same time, as a person, I feel that is somewhat problematic, because to an extent, if we are saying all voices are equal, there are people who in a room who have that higher level of, I have a personal experience as well as I have data, I've researched it, and then there's this person who has said, well, this is how I feel, and if we're making both of those voices equal, essentially there's one that is being, putting them on an equal plane. That's pretty problematic. And so for me, I guess my sort of thought or question is, I guess, how do we continue conversations and discourse, having, I guess, both people feeling comfortable to speak, but still, I guess, to an extent, still knowing, like, to be honest, there is one argument or voice or whatever that it has a little more validity than this other one.
Yeah.
Saying this is just how I feel versus this is research.
And we'll get into this, I think, in some of the methodology component, really speak to that. But what I've encouraged people in smaller conversations, when we say that, we want all opinions out. And one of the things we do in TRTW is say, really? Do we want to say that 5 is bigger than 13? There's always a line, and I'll be lawyerly, there's always a line. We want all stuff out. We don't really want the KKK opinion out, as it turns out, And then there's the question of, we're all valid, but I'm talking about where I actually grew up and the thing that happened to me, and you're talking about a Daily Kos blog that you read. The reality is we want the value, you've described the value of inclusive understanding, but we know this as educators, right? Like, we know more than our students about a lot of, the content or the professional experience, as our, Hill staffer can say. So owning up to that fact that, what, all stuff, 5 isn't bigger than 13, and how do we balance the fact that 5 isn't bigger than 13 and, Eric isn't wrong 100% because of who he votes for, and I'm not, right 100%. And we can talk about that in methodology. But I do want to put out there for you that that's an absolute that is in no way justified by, reality, that we have to say, yes, your KKK thing is the same, as some empirical thing. And we don't have to say that, yes, this thing you read once in a blog equates with having grown up in that actual country. And we just have to get to where we can, that's part of the tough conversation. Sometimes being like, Sparky, you're not kind of on that. And we can talk about that in methodology as well. More barriers? I feel like a lot of us go through the same things, right? This resonates. Okay, setting up your course.
Here we go. Okay. For me, this is about creating, like Morgan said, a safer place to discuss tough issues, to minimize discomfort and trauma that comes from that. The courses that I teach all deal directly with these issues, with race, with gender, with sexuality, with class. And I seriously doubt that there's any course you can teach today, with the possible exception of a math class, that doesn't in some way, shape, or form include discussions that will touch on these issues. So it becomes a question of how do we do this? Because class discussions and participation in them is integral to learning, which is what we're hoping to foster here, to encourage certain kinds of skills. Learning isn't a passive experience. You have to be engaged. You have to take part. It's more than lecturing and reading. It's more than just the material. Information has no intrinsic value. It's what can you do with the information. How do you think about it? How do you apply it? How do you analyze it? How do you use it to make the world the kind of a world that you want to live in? How do you think critically about it? And I believe that this occurs in class discussion, in sharing opinions, in sharing viewpoints, in talking about the issues that are important to making society the kind of a place that we want to live in. So how do we do it? Okay?
No pressure.
How do we create a classroom that does this? My students are usually pretty quick to engage and to talk about these things. Of course, there are times when there's dead silence and I want to give up, and I do. I say, you're not going to talk to me, I'm leaving. It's not worth your time, it's not worth my time. When you're ready to talk, come back, we'll talk. But in general, I don't have a lot of difficulty in getting students to talk about these issues. Am I lucky? Do I have particularly fabulous students? Am I that good? No, I'm probably not. I don't think so. I think it's because the first day of every semester, I set out about telling my students who I am and what I expect from them. What they can expect from me and what they can expect from the class. I believe that that establishes a certain degree of trust between you and the people that are in that room with you. Be real. Don't pretend to be anything other than what you are. I tell them about who I am, about my background, about my challenges, how I got to be in the front of a classroom. I advise them that I often do express my own opinions, and that sometimes I play devil's advocate, and they're not going to be able to tell when I'm doing one or the other. I disregard Max Weber's talk about professors being value-free. We are people, and they need to know that we are people and that they can talk to us. But at the same time, I make it clear to them that having opinions that are different from mine are not going to reflect in their grades. As long as they can support what they are saying with evidence, then they can argue any position that they want to argue. Okay? That it's not about what they feel. It's about what they think. That what we're here to do is to make them think critically. To engage with the material in some way. Again, it's back to what can you do with the material. The fact that you can spit it back to me means nothing, because any of us can find the material. It's what do we do with it. This takes me to the next step, okay? My expectations for them. I stress the importance of participation in class, but I make it clear that in general, aside from knowing what the material says, there are no right or wrong answers in my class. There are supported and unsupported opinions. And they cannot support their opinions with just anecdotal evidence or their feelings. They have to be able to reason. The thing that makes us different from any other animal, the thing that's most important about who we are, is that we can think, that we can do this. I have to be able to back up what they say. However, this doesn't prevent students from saying offensive, hurtful, and stupid things. We can't do that all the time. But I remind them, I advise them that we don't make ad hominem attacks, okay? We don't attack people or groups personally. We argue for or against ideas. This is a reminder that words can be hurtful, and we need to consider the feelings of other people in the room. But we won't always agree. We're not supposed to agree. We wouldn't want a world in which everybody agreed. It would be boring. Who wants boring? Well, sometimes. A little boring might be nice. Particularly in politics right now. But that's another story. Okay. Sometimes when we disagree with ideas that are offensive. Offensiveness can't be obliterated. It's a part of what our founding fathers were talking about. The free marketplace of ideas, exchanging thoughts, because that can lead to truth. That can lead to finding out where you want to go, how the world works. But there's a difference between an offensive idea and an abusive idea. And we have to be careful. That's the situation where, no, we don't want the KKK in the classroom, because there is no argument against that or for that that leads to truth, that leads to making the world what we want it to be. There's no place for those ideas in the classroom, but there is a place for things that are going to make us think. And seeing the other point of view will help us in doing that. A word about trigger warnings, okay? It's interesting. I talk about free speech a lot in some of my classes. And the students are so big on free speech. Everybody should be able to say whatever they want to say. And then I look at them and I say, so why do you all want trigger warnings? What are you all afraid of? Okay? I don't give trigger warnings in instances where I don't come in and say, we're going to talk about sexism today, or we're going to talk about class today, or we're going to talk about race, and you may be discomforted. But there are situations in which, indeed, I will warn students. I show A Clockwork Orange in some of my classes, and I say in advance, there is going to be graphic violence here. You need to be aware of that. That warrants a trigger warning. But the fact that we may say things that you may find offensive or make you discomforted doesn't require us to say, stay away. It's not a good subject for us. Free speech, okay? Full and fair exchange of ideas is central to our society and to a good undergraduate education. Education is about being discomforted sometimes. What we need to be able to do is to encourage that free and fair exchange of ideas. At the same time, to discourage students from engaging in hurtful behavior, in personal attacks, in things that come just from feelings, by informing students at the outset who we are, what we expect, what's appropriate and what's not. We go a long way to making the classroom a place where we can have these tough discussions and minimize as much as possible both discomfort and trauma. That's what I do. I don't know if it works.
So great, and I think this, we all know this is effective in our teaching to kind of go from big picture to minutiae, so that's where we're going with me. So what I want to talk about is the methodologies of making, taking what Professor Barron laid out into the smaller class discussion, assessment, syllabi, beyond. So first thing, I think this will be familiar to everybody in our, learning community. When people ask me, what are AU students like? First I say, amazing. The second thing I say is, like many throughout the country, but I would say certainly smart people, accomplished people coming out of high school, I say they often arrive at AU with greater certainty than expertise. And that might resonate with a lot of people. So one of the things, and I think this really gets to our colleagues' very, passionate, accurate stuff from the back of, they're in tribes, they're politically on one side or another, they want to do their opinions, is I'm starting SPA 189 next week. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go around the room practicing saying I don't know. We're going to practice asking people things about things they don't know, so I'll be doing, the horrendous 1986 Red Sox, and I'll ask someone, born in 1998 what that's all about. We're just going to practice saying I don't know. And we're going to talk about how I don't know is the most commonly correct answer in the world. We're going to start from there and make that comfortable. They're terrified of saying I don't know. How does this relate to tough conversations? It relates to tough conversations because, right, as Professor Barron said, there isn't a conversation about the KKK that gets you to something true. I mean, about them, being good. And there isn't a conversation about someone else knowing better about growing up in Queens, who grew in Iowa, than I, know about growing up in Queens, having actually grown up in Queens. So a little bit of I don't know sets the stage for civility, including your own I don't know. Andrea Brenner actually mentioned presenting a little bit of vulnerability once at one of these CTRL conferences. I'm willing to say the things I'm not an expert in. I'm willing to own that my identity isn't the identity of everyone in the room, setting the stage. That's one thing. Syllabus. I include a class policies and procedures component in my syllabus that I quiz them on. No credit quiz, it's on Blackboard. But it includes a bunch of stuff like emailing me at 3 a.m. is, a funny thing you did. That's quaint. That's cute about you. Not relevant to me. But it includes very explicitly what I am assessing and what I am not. I'm assessing your fluency with constitutional law. I'm assessing your, all of this with the content. I'm assessing the extent to which you engaged with the material. I'm assessing your improvement, your bravery, bunch of stuff. And then it's this bunch of stuff I am not. I'm not assessing your typicality or neurodiversity. I'm not assessing your English language learning. I'm not assessing your access to family and personal connections in the professional world. I'm not assessing what you read before you got here. I'm not assessing your opinion. I'm not assessing the extent to which you feel your high school education measured up with someone else. I am assessing what we're doing, right? It's very explicit. Like Professor Barron said, I also include a description of the difference between, I say free speech has to be useful speech. We know for a fact that you can't start talking about, so the second law of thermodynamics in my course necessarily, because we were going to be talking about District of Columbia v. Heller. So that's what we're doing. And so for a fact that your conversation about, let's take something, black on black crime, pick a thing that's like a buzz phrase from politics. That's not what we're doing today. So that's a stage setting component. Another stage setting component is I'm very explicit about my 3 pillars that I had as a manager, my 3 pillars of management. I'm going to set and enforce high expectations. I'm going to offer you the tools to meet those expectations. And I'm going to recognize your humanity. And you have to do that for each other. And finally, I require them to be self-advocates. We do have a conversation, particularly in my freshman classes, about what it means to be a college student, what it means to be a professor. It's different. They always say they consider themselves grown-ups, they want to be adults. But then when I ask them what their responsibilities are, they become very high school. So I push back. You've got to engage in some kind of self-advocacy. You have to find a way toward me to tell me what you need from me or your classmates, or find a way towards your classmates. I'm going to do my best. I can't be the only, right? I try and channel Justice Scalia, so Eric is okay. Right? We've got to do this together, and this, in part, the 100 level classes especially, is their journey toward adulthood. Now, here are some classroom exercises and things that I can recommend for you. First of all, assign people to say the opposite opinion. So I do moot court. I'm sure I can't recall the exact position, but Eric had to be a hippie, commie, America hater, right? And I've given my most pro-choice advocate of the class having to argue against bodily autonomy. Make people argue the opposite side, and you can Socratically say, Adam, tell me why capitalism is very, very bad, right? Because we have a co-god guest, colleague here. Right? So maybe you think that actually, right? Ask them to come up with things that they don't know. Remind them that this free speech thing is very nice, and we hear this all the time about, let's not make colleges safe spaces because they're going to have to be in the real world. People out in the real world, like you at your faculty meeting, or people with a job out there, they don't get to say crap like that. They get fired for saying on Facebook the things that our students do on Class of 2021 Facebook. So I'm saying, this is a good time, because AU sometimes unfortunately feels like the waiting room in front of their careers, and I try and push back. This is a good time to mention you can't do that in the workplace. Google memo, you can't do that. You can sometimes, I'm sorry, you have to balance always the unpopular, but sometimes you have to be. And I think Eric gave really great examples of how to do that. Not necessarily, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in sort of political drag here and, be someone else. But look, let's lay the groundwork. We've got 2 separate ideas. On the syllabus, we hear about balance, and this is really important. Your syllabus shouldn't all be people who look like the founding fathers necessarily. Your syllabus should have diverse ideas and identities. So I include balance. I ask. I've had great conversations with people. What's the other side of this thing? It's easier with law classes because there's a dissent often. You can be like, thank heavens, someone else wrote it for me. Another thing that I do is offer syllabus materials, neither of which are perfect. So an example would be from a class that I did that was entirely built around the free college proposals that happened actually last fall, so it was during the election. It's entirely around the free college proposals, and the little hidden Easter egg in it was that your hippie, commie, homosexual activist professor didn't like those proposals, which are liberal, and you have to shake them. You have to shake them out of the idea sometimes that there's liberal and conservative. But I had a day that the 2 readings were a piece by the Brookings Institution scholars about whether the amount you spend on K-12 ed affects the quality, and a piece by Heritage. So we know this is right, a liberal and a conservative. And the Easter egg here in the learning is that you could read both of these and not be much more educated about this actual question. They went through completely different methodologies. One of them was actually about Latin America. One of them was a bunch of stuff about like Detroit 20 years ago or something. If you're doing college stuff, you'd be able to pick out what you still don't know reading these two things. It wasn't enough to be an expert. And what we could do then is have people in a very comfortable space, to have maybe my more conservative students say, Heritage left out all of this stuff that we already learned mattered. And Brookings is trying to impose on a U.S. policy question of how much to spend on education, something they learned in like one Latin American country. So you can do imperfect readings, you know? Not everybody, you don't always have to do the most brilliant, Nobel-winning economics thing ever. Sometimes you can show them stuff that isn't good enough, especially in political classes, Oh, this is somebody's talking points. What's wrong? So use weak things. In assessments, again, I just assign the side that's opposing to them. Like, congratulations, everybody this time round has to argue that you can't ban high-capacity weapons. And now the next time around, everybody's going to have to argue a very, liberal thing. Like Professor Barron, I require it to be backed up with actual information. Finally, I spend time. I have classroom discussions. A lot of us, and this was me when I first started, I was very terrified about taking any classroom time for something other than offering people rigorous opportunities to become very fluent in the content. I was like, oh, that's kindergarten. But they really do have to learn to be college students, and they really do have to learn to be students of law, students of criminal justice, students of sociology. They have to be fluent in how we do this. Everybody starts a new job. They get a staff orientation. They get a 3-month. There's nothing we ever do. If you're a cellist, you have months of rehearsal. There's nothing we ever do professionally that doesn't include this practice time. So the things that we talk about, as I said, we talk about what our roles are, what our responsibilities are. I do an entire class on bringing the material in the context of campus speech. I talk about it. I will sometimes break and have a conversation about how an incident on campus, such as the banana incident in early last fall, this was a time that someone threw bananas. It was a very racially charged message that was sent in the dorm that my UC students were living in. And I'll break and say, how does what happened affect what we're trying to do here? And I believe that could actually happen in a physics class, honestly. Because I don't think there is a class where this won't come in. We'll have our unconscious sense of who, and the data is there. There are studies, people look at their classmates and they assess people based on their identity, based on competency. My assessments, again, I require people to argue the other side. And there are times, and this is tough because we want to be collaborative and we don't want to shut people up. There are times, and this is again another Andrea Brenner thing who gave me some advice, there are times when you have to say, we don't talk like that here. It's really hard when you're trying to create an adult learning community. But I had someone say something incredibly derisive about religious people generally in my class. It's like 95% of the human population or something. And I had to say, you know what? We don't do that. We just can't do that here. That's really hard. And that's part of the tough conversation, is the tough things that we will occasionally have to do. And it's going to be that balance between saying, you have to do this self-advocacy, and you have to be a responsible person in this learning community, just like you would at a job where you're not allowed to start spewing about, name it. You have to be a self-advocate. But the truth is, if we're sitting on this side of the room, the truth is there are going to be times when it's on us. And one thing to remember that's important is when you feel that discomfort relative to that person who said the insensitive thing about sexual violence and trauma, or you feel that discomfort relative to the person who, in my case, cited a debunked study about abortion and suicidal tendencies. When you feel that discomfort toward them because you have to confront them, because we like to be nice people because we're teachers, right? You have to remember that you've given a gift to the people elsewhere in the classroom who weren't that speaker, for the people who were on the receiving end of that actual wrong. And bear them in mind. Their silence is not a reason to discount them. It's a reason to speak up for them. So sometimes you have to have that discomfort relative to the person who's done that wrong. And I think hopefully this is a good place to now have us all do this together. No?
Relative to your comment about, we don't do that here. Is that something that you would have privately one-on-one with that student, or would you address it in the moment?
It depends. If it's the easy one, like they cited a debunked study that also is going to kind of be hurtful to people in ways, I'll just say, you know what, actually that's debunked. And I'll even put it on them. I was like, why don't you look that up and throw onto our Blackboard conversation the studies that debunk that, and I'll put that on them. If it's a truly insulting thing, it can't be, it has to be in the moment, because you have to remember what's at stake for people. Elephant in the room, it's a new political era, right? You have to remember that sometimes you're making tough choices between, it seems like you're implying that my Uncle Jed voted in a racist fashion, relative to knowing something about your student. My parents could get deported. Like, that's the world we're in. And what's at stake? One person's having to learn, I shouldn't go there. So sometimes it has to be in the moment, because the rest of your class has to hear that's not okay, so that the rest of that day can be good, and then they have that trust from you. Because I know for a fact from my students that people tune out at the moment that they hear the professor doesn't give enough of a to do that difficult thing. And you can't, and then your relationship is destroyed, and they won't be in office hours. More? This is a tough conversation now.
I was wondering if I could hear more about how trigger warnings are done well. So I'm working on trigger warnings, but I'm not quite sure I really got the art of it down. So I thought maybe it was
Sure. So my understanding of triggers is that they can be big things and they can be seemingly innocuous things for individual folks. So, for example, I have personally been triggered by a particular style of men's shoe. That's something that teachers really can't account for in the context of a classroom. However, I think this goes back to creating an environment that promotes self-advocacy, because if you call out the big things and you warn folks about the big discussions, we could make a list, sexual violence, racial violence, transphobic violence, homophobia, the big ones.
I'm going to add ableism.
Ableism, all the isms, basically. If you create an environment where you go, okay, we're going to talk about that because that touched on a sensitive subject, then when these other innocuous triggers come up where individuals have to deal with them on their own, they can feel comfortable coming to professors and being like, hey, I had a rough time with something today and I disengaged with the material, but I want to come back and help me figure out what I missed, or even as simple as letting students know that they're allowed to step out of the room, go to the bathroom, and then come back. Because that is self-advocacy. These students don't want to disengage with the material. They want to do the opposite. They really want to be a part of the conversation. And I think it's hard because the phrase trigger warning has become so loaded and people are not, really happy with that phrase. Content warning, I think, is better. Or even just, you can come up with other phrases that are less polarizing. But basically, just a heads up about the big stuff is enough to make it so that students feel that when the seemingly more innocuous triggers that are personal to them, that don't necessarily have to do with classroom material, they can advocate for themselves at that point. And I think it starts with the environment where students feel that the professors are interested in that process or helping them through that.
You had a question as well?
I just had a comment. Thinking about navigating intellectual and academic content versus emotional and feelings. And there's some biology behind this. As an anthropologist, I'd say that men are cognitively organized in certain ways, and women are too. Which is partly what makes us as different sexes. I think there's a real challenge here in terms of what our role in higher education institution, what we are meant to do in terms of delivering an education, what we're meant to do in terms of communicating and sharing information and evidence, an evidence-based environment, and how we are best able to move forward. I mean, I feel inadequate, frankly, to be as emotionally supportive as I'm, in some cases, being asked to be.
Say that.
Well,
Yeah.
I am. I'm just.
To your students, that's literally all that it takes for us is be like, okay, we're struggling too. We're trying to figure it out with you.
Well, right, but I suppose I think it's a really big societal ask, and we're not doing it very well out in society. And so we're really holding ourselves to a very high standard, and I commend us all for wanting to talk and hear about it. But I also just want to, I'm not say reset, but just flag that if this was a task that was being successful, we, as the previous colleague said, we'd have multiple examples out in the wider spectrum of the world, and problems wouldn't be, there is some level of problems, I think, that we have to face.
And one thing I tell my classes is, this in some ways is an impossible goal, but let's figure out how we can do better than America. Let's have American be in some ways better than America. Let's see how we can do it better. And another thing that is, we did this after the banana incident, is I go through on the board a series of when someone, I feel like my classroom is going well when. I feel disrespected when. And we get it right out there. What kinds of things make us feel respected? What kind of things make us feel disrespected? And then we all agree, let's try and go from there. 1, 2.
So I appreciate you saying that as someone who works in campus life and feels equipped to work with students through these difficult matters. I will say that as your colleague, to remember that we're not all in silos, that we're in this together. Yep. And I think saying that you aren't equipped, I think that's great. So know that you can refer students out to some other folks who can support you in that way. And that we are partners, that maybe if it is a difficult conversation and if a student comes to you, know the resources on campus. If someone mentions that they've been, they're a survivor of sexual assault, for example, there are plenty of folks on campus who can help navigate and work with that student. There's the counseling center, there's the academic support and access center. So I don't think we're all required to be experts a mile wide when sometimes we're just experts a mile deep. And I think, but just knowing what the landscape is around us, so we then can support students that way. And I think that's one piece of it, because I think when we're in a classroom or in a workshop or in a session where we are the expert in that space, it doesn't mean that we're everything else. And just knowing that is, okay, I don't know this, but I know how to help.
And that is not delegating in a bad way. That is not dropping the ball. That is not kicking. Remember, if you can, because for me it's very hard to delegate in that way. Remember that when you send that person to Dean of Students, to Campus Life, to Counseling Center, to these resources, you're actually sending them to someone who's better at it than we are. It's not disserving them and saying, I don't want to offer you this. And you can check back in and say, are you comfortable telling me whether these resources are supporting you? Or are you better in this process? But I got to remember, she's better at that than I am. And so it's actually improving the service to your students.
I'd like to actually make a comment. I appreciate that we're having this conversation in the spirit of openness and that sort of thing, but it's not a male-female thing, because often I feel like the students put paradigms on me of like, well, you're a woman, so you should understand. And it's like, no, actually I got here because I'm pretty much a badass, and I had to push all that stuff.
Yeah.
I had to deal with a lot of shit. So when you're talking about your professor, it's like, I can tell you horror stories about you.
We can talk.
If you only had one,
I've got a lot. I just need to pick one.
But the idea that but I think that's also sometimes the challenge, and I appreciate the idea of we should be vulnerable. But I think a lot of female faculty are like, I can't be vulnerable because I have to dance backwards in high heels just to be considered half as good as my evaluations will tell me. Your clothes are nice. I mean, the sexist and misogynist comments that students, and if we had those in the classroom, they'd be appalled. And it's like, but you feel comfortable putting those on me. So sometimes that's kind of challenging to balance. Like, I would like to be vulnerable. I would like to be able to say, I don't know everything, but sometimes, depending on what it is, it can be very
and there's
difficult.
data to support that students evaluate women actually.
And it's a clear thing of like, okay, I know I can direct this person who actually has come to my office with a trauma or this sort of thing. It's like, oh, good. I know there's specific sources, but sometimes in the classroom when you don't know, and I don't always feel comfortable like outing somebody, say, you look like it, but I want to, it's kind of this negotiation. So I think these are really important conversations, but I also think to both, and I'm hoping with some of the AUX or that maybe I'm pointing around because we're involved with that, but maybe we can also tell students like how can we work together as a team, so that the faculty can work with the students, know what to expect from the faculty, and we have more of these conversations to know how best to negotiate our work.
And that's a great segue to wrap up. So a couple things about that. There is an emerging set of conversations about getting more actual of these kinds of things in the form of panels, a lot of other opportunities for us to do this. Directly in response to you quickly, I also set up what a badass I am. Like, I'm very explicit. I'm like, there's not a chance that you know,
I do that
you know,
they don't believe me.
and that's a challenge. And well, you know, and then they're going to get a B minus. But I want to cue something to you, kind of promote something to you. They'll be hearing about more that I hope will make you a little happy, makes me happy. We're going to do for the first time on this campus, there's going to be a little mini, if you know the UGRS Undergraduate Research Symposium. This semester, I'm piloting the first campus speech, free speech and campus civility kind of actually contest where students are going to be voluntarily allowed to be in groups of up to 4, do something roughly like a group or work, like a class group project, except they want to do it. On this question, anything from should we invite Ann Coulter and Payer to talk here or exclude Milo to what we did here. They're going to have to come up with an actual problem-solving approach that has very specific, kind of imagine passing your econ or business or government or anything class of how to do this. They'll have faculty mentors. I'd very much love, faculty and staff mentors, I'd very much love it if people volunteer to mentor a group. It's roughly going to be meeting with them 3-4 times, giving them feedback on their presentations. They'll then do presentations and then, and get assessed. And then we'll have a mini symposium in which these how do we solve tough conversations and campus speech, inclusion, racism, the whole thing, that they're really having to come out with real solutions that they've thought out over the course of the semester and be challenged by a panel of judges and an audience. So you'll hear more about recruiting your students from across the campus, but in the meantime, I'd love for people to get in touch with me if they would, if they're interested about considering mentoring a group of students for this, or possibly, judging something. And you'll be getting emails about this, but we're going to kick this off Constitution Day, September 19th, with a panel that includes a First Amendment scholar and hopefully someone from K.
Thanks, guys.